There is a saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. There we go. Okay. The trick is, what is it that you measure? How do you measure? And most importantly, how do you engage the people in your organization to embrace KPIs? So what I'm going to talk about today is a framework for how you get the 8 to 10 most impactful metrics in any business or in any department. But how do you ensure that there is buy-in within the employee group of the organization so it's used most effectively? So there are 3 things that I want to talk about today. The first is, what are the common pitfalls? What are the reasons that KPIs fail in an organization? Secondly, what is that framework for getting to the 8 to 10 most impactful metrics? And then lastly, I'm going to show you some examples of dashboards that we've created for clients so you get a sense of how they look. So let's jump right in. First mistake that people make when it comes to creating KPIs is to go into a room and have a brainstorming session. The first question you need to ask yourself is, what type of business are you? Because that will lead you down a path of very different metrics. So the 3 different types of businesses, first of all, is what we call a job shop or professional service. That is a low volume, highly customized type of business. So consulting services would fall into that bucket. Construction companies, anything that is project-based would fall into this category. The second is what we call a batch operation or service factory. Typically, you have a basket of goods or services that you're offering, you're forecasting demand, and you're trying to match inventory with future purchases. And the last one is what we call continuous flow or mass service. Highly repetitive work, so insurance claims, the processing of them, hospitals, call centers. They would all be examples of a continuous flow or mass service. One of the tricks is that as I said these things and you were thinking about your business, you might be thinking that you fall into more than one of these categories, which can be true. So your business might not have a singular focus. It might need to have multiple focuses depending on the types of products or services that you offer. The second nuance to this is that if you have a highly customized manufacturing company, you'd say, well, I'm in this job shop or professional service bucket. But your accounting department, processing payables and receivables, is going to fall over here under continuous flow and mass service. So it's not just blanketing all of the different departments within a company. You've got to think about them singularly and have a different focus for each of them. So when you're in this job shop or professional service bucket, typically what you're talking about is a backlog of work. How many hours or weeks worth of backlog do you have? How many people, what equipment, what space might you need to work that backlog down? What's your forecast in the pipeline for future work? Those would all be concepts that you should start to think about if your business or your department is in this bucket. The second one, that batch operation or service factory, is about run strategies. So it's balancing the right amount of inventory that you've got against future demand. Or if you're a Good Life Fitness, what time of the day are you going to offer spin classes, yoga classes, all of the different classes so that you maximize the number of people that are attending each one? And then if you're in this last bucket, continuous flow or mass service, it's all about speed and uptime. How fast can you go? How much time are you running versus not? So thinking about KPIs in your organizations, before you run in and think about, okay, well, let's measure productivity. That can apply to all businesses, but remember, we're trying to get to the 8 to 10 most impactful metrics for any business. And that might mean that there's lots of things out there that you could measure, but there are some things that are going to have more impact than others. So that's the first thing to consider, is the type of business that you are. We're still not ready to jump into what specific KPIs to measure yet. The next thing that we have to do is consider how the business is planned. So most businesses operate with a budget. right? A financial plan or a budget. And it's not the existence of the budget that is most critical. It's how does that budget translate into a forecast or a capacity plan down to expectations of the frontline employees in the business. And those things need to be connected. The way we test for that in organizations is we go and we survey frontline people and we ask them this question. Tell us what it is that you're responsible for doing, how that is measured, and what impact you as an individual have on the financial plan for the company. Now, even that sounds fairly simple, but what we're looking for is a very specific answer. So if your role in the company is to collect receivables, and the goal is to do it in 30 days, and you're currently doing it in 40 days, the right answer would be, my role is to collect money 10 days sooner that we're collecting it now, 30 days. And in doing so, it's going to free up X thousands of dollars in cash, which is going to reduce our interest payments by X thousands of dollars. And it's a very specific answer that we're hoping that that individual gives us. When we ask that question, about half the people we ask don't know the answer to that question. About 49% of the people give us an answer and it's wrong. And only about 1% of the people can make that connection. And the reason that that's so important is in your organization, if you're going to implement KPIs, remember I said people were the #1 reason that it doesn't succeed? When you tell people you're going to install KPIs, what do they hear you say? Micromanagement. Work harder, right? No, it's a key performance indicator. That's not what they hear the leaders in the organization saying. So you have to be cognizant of that fact and realize that the humans who are being effective that need to be shown the impact that they have. The next part is that the KPI, when we put them in place with clients, we position them as a means of getting information. That is the primary goal of a KPI. You get better information so that you can see where there are problems occurring in the business. If leaders install KPIs as a motivator, so for motivation rather than information, they will fail. People will find ways of gaming the system. People who are familiar with Amazon and the unionization attempt that they had, it was all about KPIs being used in the wrong manner. So you've got to be cognizant of the human and make sure that they understand the why behind it and the role that they play. And once you've done that, you've got all of these plans in place, now you can start to think about, okay, what is it that we're going to measure that gets us to where we need to be financially? So that concept sounds great again, Andrew. How do you actually do this? So we've created something called the profit driver model. And what we've got here on the left-hand side of the dotted line is your financial statement basically turned on its side. So you've got net income, different revenue buckets, and different cost buckets. And on the right-hand side of the dotted line are all of the things that drive the various cost and revenue buckets. All the operating indicators that drive those various things. And this can get very complicated. The benefit of this model is that once people understand the relationship between the operational drivers and the financial metrics, you can tweak every one of these boxes over here by 1%, or 1 unit of measure. And when you do that on all of these boxes, what you'll start to see is that some of these things are going to have a much bigger effect on net income than others. So again, we're trying to get to the 8 to 10 most impactful metrics. This exercise helps to start to separate that. And I'll share a story of my past in the application of this. One of the roles that I had was running a powder coating company. For those that aren't familiar with powder coating, essentially you put pieces of metal on a hook. This hook is on a chain, and if everything's working properly, that chain just goes around and around all day. It goes through a booth, people spray powder on it and it goes through an oven and it gets baked on. It's a very hard form of paint. And that's about all I knew when I took over this role. That and we were losing money. So I knew that we had to change things very quickly. And I would go out into the plant and I'd spend time watching and understanding what was going on and learning, and I couldn't get over the fact that every time I walked by the two gentlemen who were applying the powder, it was like Wile E. Coyote when he spins his legs. There's a cloud of dust and this silhouette of these two humans in there. And knowing nothing about powder, I just knew that they were using more powder than they should be. So eventually I went over to them and I said, guys, can you be more precise, like with how you're spraying, or can you adjust your guns so that the fan radius goes down? And here's me 2 weeks in, like these guys roll their eyes and then they make these minor modifications. And I walk away thinking it's all fixed. And then I come back 2 hours later and what do you think's happened? Nothing. Yeah, back to square one, right? And not great management behavior on my part either. I recognize that now. What I realized is all I'd done is ask them to do their jobs better, right? I didn't connect what they were doing to the financial outcome of the company, and I didn't do that for myself. So I went back to my desk, called my powder coating rep. She told me that on average we should be using 3 millimeters of powder on the parts that we were painting. And I calculated that 1 extra millimeter, and over an entire year, it was worth $300,000 in lost profit on a company that was only doing $2 million in revenue a year. I was blown away. So the next day, everyone's coming in with their Tim Hortons coffees. I said, we're going to the lunchroom, and what I'd done is I'd written 1 millimeter on the whiteboard. So people were scratching their head, wondering what I was going to do. What I did was I showed them how 1 millimeter, 1 extra millimeter, equated to so many extra pounds a day. Our average cost per pound, I think, was about $4. And if we wasted that much powder every day for 250 days, that's how we got to the $300,000. So I didn't try to teach them how to read a financial statement. But what I did was I connected the operating world that they were a part of to the financial impact that they had in the company. Now, when I shared this story with them, about 25 people were in the room, and 20 people just started bombarding me with ideas, and this is great. But there were 5 that weren't drinking the Kool-Aid. And one of the gentlemen at the back had his arms crossed, and I remember this vividly. And finally, after all of this sort of enthusiasm and interaction, he said, what are you going to do with the $300,000? That wasn't the real thing that he was thinking, right? His thinking was that I was going to put the $300,000 in my pocket. So I said, I know what you're asking. Everyone in this room has told me in the first 2 weeks that I've been here that the wages aren't high enough, the benefit plan isn't good enough, the equipment needs replacing. And I said, we don't have the financial wherewithal to do that currently. But if we can recover the $300,000, you give me the flexibility to be able to do that. And I needed them to trust me. There was nothing more I could say. There was no bonus plan, there was no profit sharing plan. But over time, as we started to make improvements, I did make changes that required an investment, and I related it back to the actions that they took. And over time, this trust built up. And this is why I cringe when I read people's strategic plans and it says something like, we're going to install KPIs by the end of Q1. I'm like, oh no. Like, I'm going to bet against you 100 times out of 100 because there's so much communication and buy-in that needs to be in place. And I only measured one thing for the first 3 months. We only focused on one thing intentionally, even though I knew there were probably 8 to 10 that we could focus on. For me to give that explanation 8 times for all of the different things, I was going to lose them. And so we have to balance this. Our presidents and our CEOs want to have KPIs in place quickly, But if we do it too quickly, then in the end, there isn't that buy-in and understanding. So this communication and this storytelling is really around getting employees buy-in and understanding and doing things slowly but intentionally so that in a year's time, you've got that 8 to 10 metrics in place. Now, it's important, I know I'm talking to a bunch of financial executives who look at this and could create one of these in your own businesses. You can't do it. And I don't mean that literally. I mean, if you do it, the leaders of the departments who are going to use these dashboards aren't going to own it. So it's better to let them build their own and fail and it take longer from a long-term ownership perspective than for have somebody outside. Now, finance people can support and be the architects of this. Agree 100% with that, but the ownership has to reside with the individual leaders of the departments. Once this is in place, we drop the term target. So a target, I believe, is something that you shoot for and often miss. We use the term here called required result. It is a requirement to only use 3 millimeters of powder on average every day. And if we don't do it, we're not going to hit our budget at the end of the year. And there's a different connotation when something is deemed as a requirement versus a target. And then lastly, a point here, these models often get built, plans get made to grow by 20%, but nobody goes to human resources and said, can you actually hire 20% more people? How many more people do you have to interview? How many more people do we have to have in the funnel? So this approach has to be holistic. It can't just be done in silos. It all has to be checked and balanced against one another. Now, some businesses focus on more than just profit as the main driver. And we're no different. Ours is our referral rate. Does a client give us a letter of recommendation at the end of an engagement or not? But there's no mathematical connection like the slide I showed you before this to connect the dots to operating metrics. But what we do in our business is we tell stories. So our referral rate is most important. We tell stories about our director group acting out of scope. So we had a client who had 2 kids. The father was hopeful that the 2 kids would come into the business. They didn't want anything to do with it. He said to us, can you just teach them what you do in my business so they can start to understand it? And we said, sure. It wasn't in the contract. It wasn't in the scope. And at the end, they still didn't want anything to do with the business. But the father was very thankful that that exposure was given to him. And in the reference letter that he wrote, even though there was savings attached to it, what do you think the first thing he said was? Thank you for the time you spent with our kids. So we use that analogy and we intentionally insert stories in our monthly company communication so that people understand the daily behaviors that will get us most likely a referral from a client. So where do these stories show up? In what meetings do they show up? How well permeated are they throughout the organization? And there's different actions here. Our managers have to fit the culture. Our consultants have to deliver the result. There's different things people can contribute, but we're intentionally inserting in our agendas those stories so that people start to paint a picture in their own minds of the things that they can do to affect something like referral rate, or if people are familiar with Net Promoter Score, that would be another example of something it's really hard to put your finger on the activities that you can measure that are going to influence that. So we do both of those things, running the numbers and running the story. I alluded to this earlier, this next one about tweaking each of those boxes by 1%. What will happen is something like labor here, if you spend $1 million, 1% is worth 10. Not everything that you can manage has the same potential realistic improvement. Rent might be your biggest expense, but you can't do anything about it every year. So it shouldn't be a metric that you're measuring. This is just back of the hand so that you understand, again, the separation of the different metrics that you could measure. So we call that the rule of 1. So I'm still getting to the point of this 8 to 10 metrics. There are 5 different types of metrics, and the goal would be to have one metric come from each of these 5 different categories. The 5 are cost, schedule attainment, is it done on time or not? Quality, is it done right or not? Experience, customer or employee experience, and health and safety / wellness. And the reason that it's important to have one metric from each of these 5 buckets is you can do better in cost to the detriment of any one of those other 4 things. So they act as a check and balance to one another to ensure that you're not making an improvement that's having a detrimental effect somewhere else. The other part, remember I said that humans are the ones that are most likely going to make this work or not? How many of you have had KPIs in place and have had people in your business game the system? Humans, if you put a measurement in place, are going to find a way to make it look good because no one wants a number up that represents their own performance that's bad. And in my consulting career, I had an example of this. We went into an aluminum company. We worked in their plant. We freed up a bunch of capacity, and now they needed some sales to fill that capacity. And they'd never measured their sales funnel. So they'd never measure how many meetings or quotes that the sales reps had done. So we saw this as a huge opportunity. We put in place a sales funnel, and we really focused on meetings, getting the sales reps out of the office more, meeting with potential clients. And from the first day that we put this report in place, we never saw the sales reps. They were out, they were meeting with clients, they'd been order takers more than hunters or farmers, and we were feeling really good about ourselves. Until the financial statements came out. So the meeting count was through the roof, and when we saw the financial statements, they were unchanged from the month prior. So we kind of scratched our head and said, maybe there's a lag. Maybe all of this meeting activity that's being generated is going to show up next month. So wait till the end of the second month, financial statement comes out. You think there's any change? Nope. So our consultant goes out on the road the next day with one of the sales reps, and in the first meeting that they go to, the client says, "Hey Dave, good to see you. What's new since we talked last week?" And our consultant's like, "Last week? We've got all of this client's business. They are a fraction of 1% of the total business. Why are we calling on this client every week?" Well, why do you think we're calling on this client every week? Because we're measuring meetings, and nobody wants their meeting count to look negative. So we had to undo everything that we implemented and re-implement it so that the why and the intent and all of those things that I just talked about had to be re-explained. So I don't know, how many people here have read the book The Goal? Some? Okay, we give it to all of our consultants, and it's about a general manager of a business who's trying to turn it around. And there's a line in there that says, "Tell you how you're going to measure me, and I'll tell you how I'm going to behave." And keep that in the back of your minds, because if you ask for a specific thing in your metric, it's almost like Leonardo DiCaprio, Catch Me If You Can. How many people have seen that movie? He's the forger. And the FBI hires him to catch forgers because he knows how to break the system, right? In the design of KPIs, you almost have to be Leonardo DiCaprio and figure out how to break it, and then make sure people understand that those negative things that they might want to do aren't the things that you want them to do. And again, this gets back to the human aspect of it. So critical to my point of having a metric from each of these different 5 categories to make up the 8. We also look to put a leading indicator. How many people are familiar with the term leading indicator? Most people? Okay. So the idea of a leading indicator is it gives you insight into something that has yet to occur so that you can take pro-action against it. You can prevent something from happening. But they're commonly misunderstood. I hear this term a lot, and then I see what people are measuring, and it doesn't exactly fit the definition. So I want to talk you through what a leading indicator is using this example of revenue. So All companies have revenue. Revenue is driven by orders or hours or projects multiplied by the rate that we charge. Most people think that if we measure proposals, quotes, or meetings, this is a lead indicator to revenue. It's a predictor of revenue, I don't deny that, but if you talk about it in the past tense, how many meetings did we do last week? It is still technically a lag measure. But a little trick, if you insert the word planned, how many meetings did we plan to do next week or the next 4 weeks? You're now talking about something that has yet to occur, and you can actually do something about that today. If your sales reps don't have enough meetings scheduled, you can have a conversation about how to fill up their calendar. If they aren't going to get there, what other activities could they do so they add more prospects to the funnel? Again, you're talking about something before it actually occurs. So this lead measure concept is one, again, that we often hear people think that they have it because they're talking about something that's a predictor, but if it's in the past tense, it's technically not a lead measure. And with that aluminum company, we actually defined it even further. We defined not only was it how many meetings are planned, but are they planned with the right people who can buy X number of dollars worth of our services. So again, these things, I know there's a lot of details in them, but if they're not thought through at this level of detail, this is where you can get into either having too many metrics, things that people don't believe in, meetings where people argue about the validity of what's being measured. So slow and thoughtful is the way to go through this. And then I've talked a lot about the people side. How information permeates through the organization is critical. So you've got CEOs and presidents talking to VPs and managers, talking to frontline people. There's a whole bunch of people who follow up. How is information cascaded down? So the president or CEO has a meeting most likely with the executive team on a weekly basis. That executive team then goes away, and some people would meet the next day, some of those leaders with their teams. Some people might wait till Friday to meet. Some people are on a bi-weekly cadence. And if you think about that, what's happened is a message that about the operations of the business that a CEO or president has communicated to leadership is now going disparately through the organization. And so somebody says to somebody the next day after that meeting, I heard we're getting this new big contract. And if engineering doesn't have their meeting until Friday, that's news to the person that they're talking to. And the truth might be that they're bidding on it and they don't have it. And all of a sudden, and this is where we love to get, we spend time with people listening to these conversations. And it's because the whole cadence of communication isn't planned out. So it's not just having a dashboard, it's designing the system so that dashboard is reviewed at a consistent time at each level in the organization, so the information is permeated out consistently. And then within each of the meetings, there would be 3 things on an agenda. So I'm not trying to say that everyone should have the exact same agenda, but in every meeting, there should be 3 key things in my opinion. The first is to look for wins. Talk about things that went well in the last week. Anyone been in meetings where the first thing the person who leads the meeting talks about is something negative? What went wrong? It sets the stage for that entire meeting, and it's usually one of these. Look for something that went well in the last week. Look for ways to recognize people before you get into the actual results versus the required result. So wins, the second one I mentioned was a story, right, of a behavior that somebody did to influence like a net promoter score. And then lastly, review the dashboard. And then after that, each department can have their own agendas. But I would say those 3 things are critical to the success of the use of the tool and the buy-in of the people. So now I get to the big reveal, the dashboard. Yes, I know it's hard to see, and it's not the actual granularity, but it is an Excel spreadsheet. And it's not always that way, but with clients that are starting from nothing, we find that having the ability to be flexible rather than buying a sophisticated system is an easier initial first phase. So there's a couple of things I want to explain on this dashboard. The first one is that at the top there are metrics, okay? And at the bottom there are graphs. And that's intentional because if you just look at things on a weekly basis and are reacting to them, you might be chasing something that over the course of months isn't the biggest opportunity in the business. I see a lot of graphs. I know this sounds basic. If a graph doesn't have a line with a required result on it, all it's telling me is how we did versus the week or the month prior. It's a comparative, it's not a management tool. So in our case, what we do is we put a line with the required result, and if we're behind, we reforecast what do we need to do to make up for the fact that we're behind. Because if we're behind, we can't just continue to meet the requirement for the year. We have to actually do better so we get to the goal overall. So again, small, simple tweaks to make the tool more effective. These are the 5 different categories here that I talked about earlier. The required result column, so everything that is being measured, if it's hit on a weekly basis, will lead the company to hit their financial plan for the entire year. This next column is what we call best ever. So when you start out and you've set up a dashboard or KPIs and you've come up with a required result, it's still a number that a manager or a leader has told the employees they need to attain. Best ever holds that number, right? It's the best result on any one of these metrics at any given week in the year. Now, if you see that someone has done, or some group of people has done a best ever, and your agenda says recognize them, and you do in front of a group of people, how does that make them feel? Pretty good? What do they want to do next week? Do it better? What do the people who weren't part of the best ever want to do next week? They want to do, in their metric, they want to do it. So what happens over time is this number is even bigger than the required result. It's not called a stretch goal, because remember we said a KPI is about, they'll hear it as working harder. Well, guess what a stretch goal is? Working really harder, if that's such a term, right? But a best ever accomplishes the same thing, but using a different mechanism. This is something that they have proven that they were able to accomplish themselves. We've recognized them for it. So now there is an intrinsic motivation amongst the employees. It's not a top-down approach. So this best ever can be a very powerful way of getting in buy-in from the employees. We have a lead measure here. In this case, it's revenue that they plan on shipping. If it's higher than what the requirement is, they're talking this week about overtime. If it's less, they're talking about, are we laying off? Are we using it as a training opportunity? And then over on the right, you'll see 2 columns called profit impact. It was one thing for me to say to the employees at that powder coating company that 1 millimeter equals $300,000 in lost profit. It's another thing to have that show up on a dashboard week in and week out to reinforce that. So even in our dashboard, what we do is we have this column. We have 10 metrics in our business. We go over to this column that says year to date, here's how we're tracking on each of these metrics. And here's the profit impact it will have for the entire year if we continue on this trajectory. And in a half-hour meeting, we don't get a lot of time to talk about everything on this page. So what we do is we go over here and we look at the 3 things that are having the biggest negative impact and create action plans against what those 3 things, what are the root causes of those 3 things. So it's a constant reinforcement of that operating world to financial world. So this is one layout. Here's another one just as fancy in Excel. It's amazing. Is anyone here in the construction industry, first of all? Kind of? Okay, I'm going to make fun of construction industry. So, so I'll take that as we go into construction companies and they all have safety as the number 1 priority or the most critical core value in the business. And then we pick up their dashboards, and very rarely is safety the thing that is at the top of the page. So whatever you say in your business, whatever has been deemed as the most important thing, taking care of the customer, having the highest quality, having the fastest turnaround time, whatever that thing is, should be the first thing at the top of the page, because you will naturally start from the top and go down. So make sure that the design of the dashboard is aligned to do that. With most of our clients, we try to create a weekly financial statement. This is usually where the financial executives get excited, by the way. So we try to put gross profit and net profit percentages as a tool of all the operating indicators. And it's never perfect. It's what we call a directional metric. And I often get asked about this. Well, what if a metric's not dead nuts accurate? Sometimes seeing this and knowing that there's a bandwidth of plus or minus 10% accuracy is better than not seeing it at all, because the effort to get it perfect is so hard. So again, just call it for what it is. And this would be the case, but every month we reconcile the actual financials to what was estimated, and we get tighter and tighter as time goes on. Ratios. Is overtime good or bad? Depends. I can never get people on that one anymore. Yes, depends on what it's for. If it's for rework, not good. If it's because there is an increase in demand, that's pretty good. So measuring overtime on its own doesn't tell the complete story. But labor as a percent of sales, right? Overtime as a percent of sales, something that puts a denominator and a numerator together can often tell a better story than just a straight number on its own. And then we've got profit impact again over here on the right-hand side. So I know these things can look and feel differently. I know a lot of people here don't have ones that look like this. I wouldn't go back to your businesses and say, I went to the FEI event and the speaker told me I need to go to Excel and blow everything up. But what I would say is look for those bubbles, those call-outs. Is there a best ever column? Is there a required results column? Is there a leading indicator? Is there profit impact? You can incorporate that into, the red, yellow, green dashboards or whatever it is you use, but it's the visibility of those things on your dashboard that are critical. All right, so I said at the beginning there were 3 things that I wanted to accomplish. I want to talk about the pitfalls, right? What are the things that cause KPIs not to stick in an organization? Secondly, then the roadmap. How do we get to the 8 to 10 most impactful metrics? And then lastly, learn from some of the examples of the dashboards that I showed you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah?
I was at a firm and somebody brought up something that was in the 90s called the balanced scorecard. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
Is that what this kind of thing is a bit? It takes financial and non-financial, and you come up with 5, and it transformed the company because they just didn't look at net income, they looked at all the various things, and people were bonused based on that. So those 5 indicators were every month monitored. Have you heard of companies using that?
I have. Most balanced scorecards are more financially based indicators, so more detailed than just EBITDA, which is fine, but we would often do something, a balanced scorecard, and what we call a weekly management or a weekly operating report, which if you went back to the example, was all operational based metrics. So I would do both. I'd have a balanced scorecard that has the financial ones in more granularity, but then I would have something that is more granular, particularly when you get into the department level measures. Yeah, Barry.
Andrew, what is it that you guys do that you come in that we can't do for ourselves?
Do I take the bait, Larry? What do we do? So I'll give you 2 answers. You'll like one, you might not like the other. The first one is we can do this more quickly as consultants. Any consultant can do that more quickly because you're not called into a day job. We can spend time going around and doing all of the explaining and figure out all the connecting and the building and the data collection. and we can do it quickly, right? And so the next thing is, could we do it more effectively? And without trying to say to financial executives that we could do it more effectively, this is what we're experts in. So I would hope that we are able to, from our experience building dashboards, and I'll say this, it's the people side that I really think that we're experts in. Like, everyone in this room could eventually figure out what the right metrics are. The people side is the secret sauce. How are people going to react? How much time does it take to communicate in advance and anticipate the resistance and the problems that are going to permeate with everybody and get out in front of them? And that's where we're, having done this, repetitively, we know where those pockets of resistance are and how to break them down, and we can go out and spend the time so that the likelihood that when these go in place, they're embraced is greater. Yeah, Rob.
Andrew, there's a lot of private companies that I've come across that don't believe in this concept called open management, I think it's called, right? Where they don't necessarily like sharing the financials. In fact, they keep they leave it under lock and barrel.
Yeah.
So when you come across those companies, what do you tell them?
To an individual owner, there's sometimes nothing you can say to them to convince them that managing with an open book is a more effective way of doing things. And so you've got to gauge whether you can win that battle or not. And if the answer is no, you might have to do things in baby steps. So we had a company that had a profit sharing plan, but they never told the employees how much profit they were making. Well, I know. So there was this magic formula in the background, but what they did is they always baselined back to the year before. So what they said was, last year, if our profit was 1, we're budgeting to be 20% better. And if we are, that's going to increase your profit sharing by X. So, and it worked. Like, people could do the math themselves on what it meant to them financially, but they never got to know what the true profit of the company was. And I understand the hesitancy. If you were in a business and the employees knew you were making $5 million in profit, they would assume that that's $5 million in cash in your, they don't understand, the reinvestment. You can go down that path eventually and explain it to people, but if you can't, then you can still have the same effect using an indexing. So I've seen that be an effective sort of interim step.
Just looking at it,
Yeah.
I immediately see data collection.
Yes.
Huge exercise through this. And then I kind of think, well, there's certain companies that just don't have that amount of data available.
Yep.
You sort of target larger companies, is that a fair statement, or how do you deal with smaller companies?
We follow the adage that simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication. And what I mean by that is, I know what you're saying, that the data collection can seem cumbersome. And it's often, taking a step back and understanding what the intent is. The intent of a dashboard or any metric is to have a conversation. Like, the data, that's all the data does, is it tells you something's working or not working, so you talk about how to make it better. And if you look at it from that premise, you'd say, okay, well, wait a sec. Can I still have the conversation without creating something cumbersome? And I had this exact example with a chain of butcher shops in Vancouver. And the owner was waiting for an RFID tagging system for all the meat packages to understand how many stockouts he was having every day. And I was like, does somebody at the store know when you're out of pork tenderloin? And he said, yeah, the butcher knows. Like, how does the butcher know? Well, he looks in the row that says pork tenderloin and there's nothing there. I said, could he send somebody an email or write stock out in an Excel column? And wouldn't that be better than nothing? And I was being a little bit cagey and facetious with him, but this is what I'm using a story to answer the question, is that my belief is that the answer is actually simpler than most people make it out to be. And yes, there are big and sophisticated data collection systems, but for small and medium-sized companies, there's usually ways of getting information to prompt a conversation that don't involve big, elaborate systems.
And I mean, I think we're on the risk that it's not sustainable. You may go in and do this work.
Absolutely.
It's just too much effort.
Yep.
I'm just going to say, I don't see the benefit of this stuff.
Totally. Yeah.
Just to build on that point, how do you make sure that people are going to buy into the KPIs?
So it starts with the explaining of how they impact them. Like, what influence does that individual have on this metric? And what does that contribute to the financial goal? That's the starting point. And then as things change and things improve, we find that recognizing those best performances. One of Gallup's study, before people said that they want more pay, it's actually more recognition that is the thing that they want the most of. If you design a system that tells you when people are doing something that they've never done before, and they hear their name called out in a bunch of people, most people will be motivated to do that again. And they're just little intentional things, but those things are the difference between a report showing up when someone opens their laptop and somebody expects them to go and do something versus really ingraining it in the business. So there's lots of other little nuances, but if I was going to pick two, those would be the two things that I would say have the most impact. Yeah, Rob.
So one of the things I think you're advocating for also to get these KPIs disseminated is some kind of meeting cadence.
Yes.
And how do you establish that in organizations that are, I would say, meeting fatigued? Right?
Yep.
There's just too many meetings, and now you're having meetings for these KPIs.
So one of the things that we do when we go into businesses is an analysis of all of the meetings. And typically what we find is there are more meetings already than are necessary. The meetings that are being conducted are ineffective. We schedule it for an hour because Outlook defaults to an hour when it could be 45 minutes. So people find, you fill the time. Isn't that the Peter principle, right? You fill the time allotted. So the first thing we do is we analyze the meetings and look for opportunities to consolidate meetings, remove meetings, reduce the number of attendees, improve the effectiveness. And if the dashboard isn't already a part of it, then we'll say, okay, we're not asking for more time in a meeting. We're asking for the same amount of time, but it's going to be more effective because now we're going to review how the operation is actually doing and put plans in place to solve the root cause of problems. So it's a good point, because if you just layer a meeting onto an organization that hasn't had one, there will be meeting fatigue that if it's not already crept in well. Yeah.
Has AI affected what you do at all?
It has affected conversations that we're having, and in looking at forecasting tools, how incorporating AI can help creating a better plan. On the data collection side, not so much. Creating apps, like when I think AI, I think, okay, what have innovated? We've created apps now that supervisors can just plug data in right out on, like in the office or in the floor. If you count that as AI, it's not intelligence, it's just a cleaner way of data collection.
I would imagine you guys have migrated from Excel to Power BI.
We have. For most clients, depending on where they are from an evolutionary perspective. But
I remember working with you guys in
Yeah.
2008. You guys were doing things with Excel that I've never even seen before.
Yeah.
Back in 2000.
Back in 2008, yeah. I would say the majority of what we're doing now is in Power BI. Very similar. For those that don't know Power BI, very similar to Excel. It's just got the capabilities of pulling data from multiple different data sources. So you could pull financial data, ERP data, accounting data, all from different sources into one, which Excel could never do. So it's a more sophisticated tool, but if you know Excel well, it's intuitive to build and to create dashboards like that. Yeah.
I just have a question. people use this to base some of their compensation and bonuses based on departments, incentivize the results?
They do, but I will caution people that if this is being developed for the purpose of that, that you can't install a bonus plan until this is all settled for a year. Because if you're developing this and 3 months in, the way you're tracking something or what you're tracking changes and it's tied to people's compensation, KPIs are going to be a dirty word. So I would say if you don't have a plan and you wanted one, I'm not a fan of subjective bonus plans, but I would do a subjective bonus plan for a year and let this evolve and stabilize and then tie metrics. But I'd really think about my Leonardo DiCaprio scenario. How do I break this? In what scenarios are we paying people a bonus when the company is losing? Like bonus plans are great, but bonus plans that are not thought out with all of these sort of different iterations in different cases can have a negative effect as well. Yeah.
Question, ESG.
Yep.
So a lot of the KPIs we showed are internally focused.
Yes.
ESG now is going to be externally focused.
Yeah.
Does that change a lot of what you do or how you approach things relative to maybe the bigger companies?
It hasn't yet. Most of our projects have been internally, operationally focused rather than external. But certainly companies are thinking about measuring things from an ESG perspective more. So for us, it hasn't changed what we're doing. Yeah. No more questions? Okay. Thank you.